This parsha, there are many things that happen. Yaakov Avinu is running away because he's really leaving for two reasons. And one reason is that his brother Esav wants to kill him. And the other reason is that he has to find a wife. And Abraham had a tradition that was passed down to Yitzchak that the wife could not be taken from the Canaanite women. It had to go to Abraham's family. And therefore, Yaakov needed to leave Eretz Yisrael, and he needed to go to Haran, which is around the Mesopotamian area. So there are two separate reasons. In fact, you have to understand that the reason why Rivka tells Yaakov to leave is not the reason why Yitzchak tells Yaakov to leave. Rivka tells Yaakov to leave because Esav, your brother, wants to kill you. Yitzchak may not even be aware of that. Yitzchak may still think that Esav is not such a bad guy. But Yitzchak's argument is you have to leave to find a wife. Just as Yitzchak's wife was from Haran, the difference is that Yitzchak himself didn't leave because Yitzchak could not leave Eretz Yisrael, so it had to be done through Eliezer. But Yaakov himself is able to leave. So in this parsha, Yaakov is gone for a total of 20 years. There are 7 years in Lavan's house that he works to get Rachel, and he winds up getting Leah. And then he works another 7 years for Rachel. And then he works another 6 years to build up his fortune to be able to become self-sufficient. So Yaakov is gone for a total of 20 years. And then it takes 2 years on the road to get back. So he is separated from his father for a total of 22 years. I'll come back and add some years to that in a moment. So Rashi brings a very well-known medrash that because Yaakov was separated from his father for 22 years and he didn't honor his father and fulfill Kibbud Aviyim, that is why Yosef was separated from Yaakov for 22 years. Yosef was sold when he was 17 years old, and Yaakov did not see Yosef till Yosef was 39 years old. It's a midah keneged midah. The 22 years that Yaakov did not honor his father are the 22 years that Yosef did not honor his father. Now, Rashi has a very interesting and complicated chronology. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but Rashi points out that although in the Torah there's only a 22-year absence that is recorded, in other words, for Yaakov, 776 plus 2 years of travel, so 776 is 20, 2 years of travel back is 22. In fact, there was another 14 years you have to add to the equation, and that is when Yaakov left Eretz Yisrael, or at least when he left Yitzchak's house, he took a little detour before he went to Lavan, and he went to the Yeshiva of Shaim and Eiver for 14 years. And he learned Torah there. We'll talk about what type of Torah they learned. And it was only after those 14 years in which Chazal record he did not sleep for 14 years. Now, I don't think we have to assume he literally did not sleep. But, he didn't stay in a bed. He was dozing off, whatever it would be. So really, Yaakov was not away from Yitzchak for 22 years. Yaakov was away from Yitzchak for 36 years. 22 plus 14. All right, so why is it, therefore, that Yaakov is only punished for the 22 years of separation and not for the additional 14 years? So the Gemara in Megillah says, from here we learn out that the mitzvah of learning Torah is so great that it overrides the failure to give honor to parents. So for the 14 years that Yaakov was in the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver, there was no punishment for his lack of Kibbud Aviyim. Tremendous thing. This is Nogea Lahalacha as well. If you're in yeshiva and your parents demand that you leave yeshiva, so although you always have to be respectful and the like, according to halacha, there is no Kibbud Aviyim. Now that doesn't mean you don't listen to your parents, meaning people misunderstand this sometimes. For example, Kibbud Aviyim does not apply to learning Torah. Kibbud Aviyim does not apply to shidduchim. If your parents don't approve your marriage partner, there's no chiyuv to listen to them. But a lot of people misunderstand this. They think if I'm not chayav to listen to my parents, I should therefore disregard what they say. No. Just because you're not chayav, they can't pull out kibbud aviyim as a trump card that says, you have to listen to me. That doesn't mean they might not be right. In other words, one should always pay attention to what one's parents say, whether or not there is a technical chiyuv of kibbud aviyim. Mark Twain once remarked that when he was 17, his parents were very, very foolish. By the time he was 24, he was amazed at how intellectually they grew in just the span of those few years. Now, what he means basically is his parents didn't change, but as we grow older, we often see the wisdom of our parents that we dismissed in the foolishness of youth. I don't know if your parents told you this, but the old curse, it's a gentle curse, it's not that parents would give their kids is, may you grow up and have children like you, meaning to say you'll have kids that'll be disagreeing with you, and then you'll understand what your parents' position was in all of those situations. So, but it is true that even though one should respect parental judgment, they don't have a kibbud aviyim veto on you in terms of yeshiva, in terms of shidduchim, in terms of aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. That is really your decision, but you obviously look at your parents' input and you try not to hurt them in whatever way. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is, if your parents disagree with your yeshiva choice, you don't have to listen to them, but they don't have to pay for it either. So, so as a result, your ability to make a decision doesn't mean that they have to agree with it, and therefore you might be on your own, which is another thing to keep in mind as well. And again, this is really not our topic, and there's maybe much more time than I'm devoting to it, but let me just add, as a matter of common sense, just common sense, it is normally very, very important and desirable that you keep a good relationship with your parents when it's possible. This goes beyond the technicalities of halacha, that even when halacha says there's no chiyuv of kibbud aviyim, keeping a good relationship with your father and mother is very, very, very important. It's important for your spiritual growth. It's important for your psychological and emotional growth, your ability to eventually have a family. Now, it may be true that there are rare circumstances, rare, very rare, where one does have to cut off a relationship with parents. But that's not because they're not from or something like that. That wouldn't be a reason. But if they're seriously abusive, there may be issues of sometimes cutting off a relationship, but that has to be looked at as a form of amputation. And the same way that, God forbid, sometimes you have to amputate an arm. But that is a last resort. Amputation is not the first thing you do when there's a problem. So God forbid, there's sometimes in rare cases, maybe a concept of amputating a relationship with parents. But that is way, 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 way beyond the norm. And that is not the default situation that you pursue. So one has to be very careful, because I hear this all the time. When people learn the halachas of kibbud aviyim, that they're not obligated to listen to their parents, they assume that automatically means that I don't have to pay attention to what they're saying. That's not emes, and keeping that relationship is extremely important. But be it as it may, though, you do see that Yaakov, going back to the Parsha, you do see that Yaakov was not punished for the 14 years of the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver. Yaakov was only punished for the 22 years he was in Lavan's house. But there's something very difficult here. Why is he punished for the 22 years? You're telling me he's punished for the 22 years because he didn't honor his father for those 22 years. Who told him to go? His father and his mother told him to go. They told him, get out of here. Go to Lavan's house. So what sin did Yaakov commit by being gone for all of that time, even for the 22 years? He went at the command of both his father and his mother. So really, it's kind of difficult to understand what bichlal is the idea of an onish here. But the short answer might be, I don't know, unfortunately we give different answers, that even though Yitzchak and Rivka told him to go, they didn't tell him how long to go. Certainly Yitzchak didn't tell him to go. Yitzchak basically told him, go get a wife and come back. Well, how long did it take for Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak? Well, there was traveling, and that was miraculous, and one day. So Yitzchak may have legitimately figured that Yaakov would be gone like for one day, and maybe he'll have a miraculous travel and get there right away. And therefore, Yitzchak may not have expected that this may have been an unpleasant surprise for him, that Yaakov was gone for so many years. That might be one answer, and that's why Yaakov is nenash for that lack of kibbud of v'yem. Okay, so that's like one idea. But the second idea I want to discuss with you is, what on earth is this yeshiva that is called the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver? Right? I've heard of Mir and Panovich and Chevron and or Sameach, right? Those are the famous yeshivas. What's the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver? Right? Shame and Eiver. Well, first of all, who is Shaim, of course? Shaim is actually Avraham's own ancestor. Shaim is the son of Noach, the righteous son of Noach. And in fact, the word Semite, comes from Shem. The descendants of Shem are the Semitic people. Jews are the most important ones, right? But you have other Semitic people as well, the Arabs or whatever it would be. So Shem is Shem ben Noach, and Eiver is the grandson of Shem, which is also the ancestor, one of the ancestors of Abraham, right? Shem and Eiver. By the time Yaakov goes to the yeshiva, Mr. Shem is no longer alive. Shem has already died, but Eiver is still running the show. Eiver is the grandson of Shem, and the like. And they established, after the flood, Shem established a great yeshiva, a great academy. What did they learn in the yeshiva of Shem and Eiver? I mean, did they learn Bava Kama? Did they learn Gemara? I mean, was there Gemara? I mean, the Chumash, the Torah wasn't given yet. This is all before Matan Torah. And besides, Shem and Eiver aren't even Jewish. They are B'nai Noach. They are righteous Gentiles, technically. So what would the nature of the yeshiva of Shem and Eiver be? It's a little bit of a mystery because we don't have any transcripts from the yeshiva of Shem and Eiver. But I would suggest there might be three things that would be on the curriculum of the Yeshiva of Shem v'Eiver. First would be halachic analysis of the 7 Noachide laws. Now you might wonder, well, how long does that take? The Noachide laws are 7 laws. You could say them over in 5 minutes. What would Yaakov be doing studying the Noachide laws for 14 years? But the truth of the matter is, Noachide laws can be a lot more complicated than you would think, and in some ways, it will overlap a lot with Jewish law. For example, one of the Noachide laws is not stealing, just like the 10 Commandments. For Jews, we have the commandments. Actually, the 10 Commandments, that's not really true. In the 10 Commandments, just as a point of general information, when the Torah says do not steal in the 10 Commandments, that actually refers to kidnapping. That is not the source of stealing money. There are other verses in the Torah that talk about stealing money. So that's a very common misconception. People think that Jews are not allowed to steal because it's in the 10 Commandments. That's not the source. There are other sources. Okay, but nevertheless, it's in the Torah. So the Noachide law also applies, don't steal. Now, stealing has many implications. What about misrepresentation? What about fraud? What about downloading copyrighted music from a website, right? Stealing is a complicated issue that requires a lot of halachic analysis, okay? Do not murder, does that include abortion? Which it does. So the point of the matter is, even in halacha, the Noachide law can have a lot of halachos that are involved into it, in which you can debate and you can discuss and the like. So first item of the curriculum would be, we'll call that the halachic part of the curriculum, would be a study of the Noachide laws and their implications, which could be very, very far-reaching. Second aspect of the curriculum, we can call Kabbalah, mysticism, in the sense that this was a school or a yeshiva that focused on trying to understand the nature of God and how he relates to us. Rav Aryeh Kaplan suggests that part of the curriculum was deep meditation techniques to achieve prophecy and divine inspiration, right? So it's more in the mystical realm. The idea, instead of focusing necessarily on laws, halachos, although they had that as well, It was a school of communion with God in various ways. A school of prayer, a school of devotion, a school of meditation, a school of contemplating the nature of the divine essence. We would call, again, I'm using Kabbalah as an anachronism. They didn't call it Kabbalah in those days, but what would later be called the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, these were some of the things that were learned in the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver. Again, Rabbi Kaplan suggested it may have been like a school of prophecy, a school of meditation, a school of contemplation, and the like. And the third subject we'll call Musa, and that is how does one perfect one's character, one's midos? How does one relate with other people in a generous way of compassion, right? This would be a school of Musar and character building. So this was the Yeshiva of Shame Eiver. So it looked a little different, I think, than a modern yeshiva that would be focusing on written books, written texts, because in point of fact, there were few, if any, written texts. I mean, there was no Chumash, there was no Mishnah, there was no Gemara, there was no Shulchan Aruch, right, you see? But it was all based on trying to understand the nature of God and what is God demanding of us, and how do we perfect our characters and our midos to be worthy of being repositories for the divine. By the way, these are all related. The Rambam writes in his introduction to Pirkei Avos, a very, very famous introduction that you should learn at some point in your life. This is called the Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters. It's interesting. Pirkei Avos only has 6 chapters, 5 of Mishnah and 1 of Brisa. The Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos has 8 chapters, so the introduction has more chapters than the book for which it is an introduction. But the Rambam, in his introduction to Pirkei Avos, talks about the idea that good midos, perfection of character, is a prerequisite for prophetic revelation. Because he says, with some exceptions, God allowed Bilam to be a prophet, even though Bilam was a bad guy because he had to give a prophet to the Gentiles, etc. That's an exception. Bilam is a very anomalous exception of an evil person who was given the gifts of prophecy. But normally, prophecy is correlated with a perfection of your character. And in the Rambam's language, every defect in a character is like a mechitza. It's like a wall of separation that separates you from God. So if you're more or less a very fine person, but you have like one bad thing, that's like one wall that's separating you. If you have 5 bad midot, there are 5 walls that are separating you. And therefore the Rambam says the clarity of prophecy depends on the perfection of character. But again, let me emphasize, perfection of character is necessary but not sufficient. In other words, the Rambam makes the point that it might be that a person has a wonderful, beautiful character, but he's not yet going to get prophecy. Prophecy requires other things. It also requires intellectual preparation. It requires a certain innate talent. So the Rambam is not suggesting that everybody who perfects their midos is going to get prophecy. But the Rambam is saying that one who has not perfected his midos is definitely not going to get prophecy, except in very, very rare cases. That is why, in addition to the Shaim Eiver, it's very, very clear that in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, which is much later, there actually were prophecy schools. And throughout the book of Shmuel, it talks about the children of the prophets, and that actually means the disciples of the prophets. So what does it mean, disciple of the prophet? There were prophecy schools where you would go to learn meditative techniques to facilitate prophecy, but that didn't mean you became a prophet, because you also had to have certain natural inclinations, but at least you learned some of the techniques. Okay, so that was the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver. So now, the next question is, why did Yaakov feel he had to go to this Yeshiva of Shame Eiver? I mean, it's not as if Yaakov is coming out of nowhere. Where is Yaakov coming from? He is coming from the home of Yitzchak and Rivka. And in turn, that was the home of Avram and Sarah. And Yaakov Avinu not only learned spirituality, from his father and mother. He learned from his grandparents, because remember that Avraham did not die till Yaakov and Esau, who were twins, were 15 years old. So Yaakov had a number of years even with Avraham. So l'chaira, Yaakov did not need to go to the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver for 14 years. Why was not the Torah that he learned from the Avos, why was that not sufficient to provide him with what he needs now that he's going to Lavan? What was unique, so to speak? What was irreplaceable with the Yeshiva of Shame Eiver that he did not get from Abraham and from Yitzchak? So Rav Yitzchak Hutner, the great, really unforgettable Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, offers a very, very beautiful insight. He says that Yaakov grew up, he had Esav, of course, which was a source of trouble, but Yaakov grew up in a very, very spiritual environment of Kedusha. By the time Yaakov was born, Avram came to Eretz Yisrael as a loner. He was the only one who believed in God, and indeed he broke new ground in bringing people to Hashem. But Avram was extraordinarily successful. Avram was makarev thousands and thousands of people to believe in Hashem. And because of this, Avram was respected, Avram was admired, Avram was looked up to. So Yaakov was born in an environment in which many, many people believed in God. Avram's household itself was very large, and the ripple effects of Avram's outreach efforts were still very, very evident. So it's as if to say, Yaakov grew up in an atmosphere of Kedusha, of holiness, in which many, many, many people were serving God. Now, Yaakov is now leaving the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, and he's leaving the environment of Avram and Yitzchak and Rivka and Sarah, and he's going to a place full of tumah, full of avodah zarah, full of dishonesty, full of cheating, full of immorality. And he is going to be the only one who stands up for holiness and belief in God. And he's going there initially as a single person. Then eventually he will get wives and children. But even then, with all of his children, he had 11 of the tribes in Haran. Only Binyamin was born back in Eretz Yisrael when he came back. But even at Yaakov's height, he has 12, he has his wives and 11 sons. So Yaakov is going to be confronting for the first time in his life, what is it like to be alone? What is it like to be the only one who believes in Hashem, surrounded by a decadent, immoral society? A society that denies God, a society that believes in paganism, a society that is dishonest and corrupt. How do you survive such a society? How do you preserve your spiritual core when everybody around you thinks you're crazy, you're wrong? That he couldn't get necessarily from the environment that he grew up in. Because by the time he was growing up in his environment, many, many people were believing in Hashem. Yeah, Avraham went through that experience, but that was a long time ago. So, this is what he gained from Shaim and Eiver. Shaim, actually, he was not alive then, but Shaim lived before the flood. Shaim lived in a world with Noach, his father, that was corrupt, that was evil. Shaim lived in a world where Noach and his children, his family, were the only ones who believed in Hashem and behaved in accordance with Hashem's will. And therefore, when Yaakov needs to gain the strength of not being affected by the evils of the society that he's going into, he needed to get that chizuk from the vestigial memories that were preserved in the Yeshiva of Shame Eiver. How to survive when you're the only one. And that's a big, big challenge. And Yaakov gave himself 14 years to absorb that type of challenge. That gave him the fortitude and the strength and the courage and the inner commitment not to be broken spiritually by his encounter in the house of Lavan. And Yaakov was very afraid of this. Yaakov was afraid. When Yaakov is running away, Yaakov feels he is running from the frying pan into the fire, because the Esav in Eretz Yisrael is going to destroy him physically. But the Lavan in Haran may destroy him spiritually. And Yaakov is very, very afraid of that. Now, if you think about that, if this is Yaakov Avinu's concern, this is a concern that all of us have in various ways, right? A person comes to yeshiva, but most people are not going to stay in yeshiva forever. Most people are going to go back to whatever it was they were doing. I mean, some people will stay, but not everybody can stay. And whether you go back to college, you go back to the working world, you go back to the United States or Australia or England, whatever country you come from, and you're going to face this challenge because, you're in yeshiva. So Baruch Hashem, you're surrounded by people who are learning. You're surrounded by people who are doing mitzvos. This is your environment. Yeshiva has many, many challenges, but in a way, it's kind of easy to be a religious Jew here. Even if you wanted to eat treif, where are you going to find it, right? And Baruch Hashem, Yerushalayim, okay, Rabbanut, okay, go to plain Rabbanut, you're eating treif, right? That's what people think. But that's not true. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you ate plain Rabbanut, you're not going to go to Gehenna for it, and the like. So, Baruch Hashem, we live in an environment in Yerushalayim, Ira Kodesh, where you have to go out of your way not to keep the Torah, not to keep the mitzvahs. Right? Hashem made it relatively easy. Again, I don't mean to minimize the challenges we face even in yeshiva, but it's kind of easy, in that sense. But then we go back to a different type of world. And we go back to a world where most of the Jews, the overwhelming majority of the Jews we're going to encounter, don't keep the mitzvahs, don't care about it. And not only people are not religious, but the world as a whole is immoral in so many ways, in terms of sexual promiscuity, in terms of drug addiction, in terms of hedonism, in terms of selfishness and self-centeredness. And what's going to happen, right? We gain so much from our time in yeshiva, but then we were plunged into a world where, okay, maybe we're not going to be the only one, depends on where you live, but in some situations you might be the only one. You go back to a college campus, right? There are cases where you might be the only person who keeps kosher. Right? Baruch Hashem, most people don't have as extreme a situation like that, but some people do. And it's so easy to kind of just give up or just weaken your commitment. And you see that even Yaakov Avinu was afraid of that. Yaakov Avinu was afraid that he would be affected. And he needed 14 years of chizuk to be able to strengthen himself, that he would not be dragged down. So it's a very, very big challenge. It is a big challenge. I mean, I can tell you this. I know myself of kids who are not even Balei Tshuva. They come from Orthodox families, just Orthodox families. They were Shomer Shabbos all of their lives. And after finishing high school, some of them would go to a secular university, like University of Maryland, where I'm from. And, it's very, very sad to know how quickly you can lose things, you can regress. That, within 6 months, some of the kids, not all, stop wearing tefillin every day, stop davening every day. They kept Shabbos on some level, but not completely. And you'd figure, somebody, I mean, if these are FFBs, these are from birth, right? You know the abbreviation. I mean, they had Jewish education since kindergarten. And in 6 months, you could just lose all the stuff that you've been doing your whole life. And again, I'm not looking down at them because, I can't judge anybody. Who knows what I would do? I might have the same problem. But the point is, it is a problem, and it is a risk, and it is a reality. We are affected by our environment in so many different ways. And the point I'm making is that even Yaakov Avinu, who was phenomenally great, he's the greatest of the Avos, on God's divine throne is engraved the face of Yaakov Avinu. Even Yaakov Avinu is frightened over what Lavan's house could do to him and his family. And Yaakov needed 14 years to get the chizuk to be able to survive that particular experience. So that kind of reminds us a little bit how careful we have to be. Again, I hope that you'll stay in yeshiva as long as you can. But if you do have to go back, and eventually most people do have to go back, you understand the need to be Makhazik. Chazal have a beautiful metaphor that describes this. They say that Torah is as hard to acquire as gold and silver vessels, and is as easy to lose as glass. Right? Gold is expensive, right? I want to acquire gold, I got to work very hard, I got to make a lot of money. So Torah is like gold, doesn't come cheap. Not in terms of money, but in terms of effort, in terms of time, right? You work hard for gold, you work hard for Torah. So acquiring Torah is like acquiring gold. But it's hard to get, hard to come by, but very easy to lose. It's as easy to lose as glass, right? Glass, right? What the problem with glass, of course, is you drop it and it smashes. So that's the metaphor. It's as if to say, I acquire the gold, but then it becomes like glass. Hard to get and easy to lose. So I don't mean to be overly pessimistic, but it's something that all of us do have to be aware of. And that is why when you're back in Chutz La'aretz, you're back in college, you're back in work, whatever it is, you got to make a special effort to remain connected to Hashem and to the mitzvos and to Torah. I think I mentioned this more than once, and many of you are probably familiar with this. Rav Aaron Lapiansky, who's a Rosh Yeshiva in my old town of Silver Spring, Maryland, wrote a very, very excellent book. I think it's called Ben Torah for Life, which specifically deals with how do you remain a Ben Torah when you're not in the yeshiva anymore and you're involved in the working world or the college world. How do you maintain your enthusiasm and your commitment? And that's a very, very important work for people to be aware of, because it is a genuine challenge that we are going to face. Okay, so that's kind of the story of the Yeshiva of Shame and Eiver, and why Yaakov found it necessary to go to that yeshiva. Now, one other point. It mentions that Yaakov encountered the place, and he stopped because the sun set. And Rashi explains, kind of scary, the sun set prematurely. All of a sudden it becomes dark. And Yaakov encounters the place. So Rashi has a whole cheshbon. Actually, Hashem brought the Temple Mount over to where Yaakov was. Yaakov is not in Yerushalayim, but somehow as he's traveling, Hashem brings the Temple Mount over. Yaakov doesn't know this, and he finds himself sleeping on the Temple Mount. And the vision of the ladder of the angels going up and going down is because he is literally on the Makam of the Beis HaMikdash. Even though he's not there, but kind of that Makam got moved. Now, on the drasha, Vayifka b'Makam, he encountered the place. Rashi brings the Gemara in Brachos that says, Pigia, encountering, is a term for prayer. And it's very interesting. Abraham enacted the obligation of praying in the morning, Shachris. Yitzchak enacted the obligation to pray in the afternoon, which is Mincha. And Yaakov enacted the prayer of the nightfall, which is Ma'ariv or Arvis. Now, let me make 2 points about this. Point number one is when we say Avram did Shachris, Yitzchak did Mincha, and Yaakov added Ma'ariv, we don't mean that they composed the actual liturgy of the Shmona Esrei. The words of the Shmona Esrei were not composed until the beginning of the Second Temple by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, the people of the Great Assembly. So how did Avram daven Shachris? How did Yitzchak daven Mincha? How did Yaakov daven Ma'ariv? That's not referring to they had a siddur with all of the prayers. They prayed in their own words. But the concept of morning, afternoon, evening comes from the Avos. That's point number one. Point number two is that this is the prayer, this is the tefillah, but the Kriya Shema, which is a mitzvah of the Torah, that's morning and evening, that's in the Torah. Although that didn't apply then, but later that becomes the Oraisa. So Yaakov Avinu enacted the prayer of Ma'ariv, and I'll talk about it Friday night at much more length, but I just want to throw out the idea that Rav Tzadok of Lublin says that there's something deeply meaningful about Ma'ariv, because Ma'ariv is the prayer of darkness. And Yaakov Avinu is teaching us that even when our life seems dark and hopeless, and without any way out, because that's how Yaakov is feeling at this point, I have emunah that Hashem will take care of me. Because again, you may say, well, what's so dark? Yaakov had this beautiful dream about the ladder. No. He had the dream of the ladder after he davened. This was Hashem answering his prayer. When Yaakov davened, all he faced was darkness. The light of Hashem came to him as a result of his prayer. And therefore, the godless of Ma'ariv is to be able to feel the presence of Hashem and the benevolence of Hashem, even in the darkest moments of human existence. And that is why Ma'ariv is called the prayer of emunah, the prayer of faith. For example, in Kriya Shema of the morning, after we finish the Shema, we say, Emes v'yatziv. God's truth is firm and upstanding. I can see it. It's standing in front of me. In Ma'ariv, we say Emes v'emunah. I have faith in God's truth. I don't necessarily see it yet. I have faith that it's there. Okay, this is the notion of Ma'ariv as the prayer of emunah. Okay, so we'll stop here. Wish you all a good Shabbos and take care.